instructors. A fortnight ago, you joined us hour one around the gradual release of responsibility, and all of us at BASTO were absolutely floored with the response. We had just under 950 of you tune in live, and since then hundreds have caught up on the recording. It's been great to see so many of you engage online, whether you've connected with your virtual community of practice via the Webinar 1 discussion board, reviewed the recording, read the summary of the Webinar 1 Padlet, or submitted your webinar assignments. We've actually been blown away with the responses we've had over the last fortnight, with over 1,000 webinar assignments being submitted. Just like with Webinar 1, we've assembled another group of master trainers who will facilitate today's webinar, and I can't wait to introduce you to them shortly. Today, we're hoping to build on your understanding of the gradual release of responsibility as we examine the workshop model in more detail. Just some housekeeping reminders before we begin. To those of you who have successfully joined us for the live stream again, welcome back. Just as you did last time, we'd love you to view today's webinar through the Webinar 2 page in BASTO 307. Here you'll have immediate access to the YouTube live stream, as well as the Padlet back channel and the second webinar assignment you'll be submitting later in today's session. It was great to see so many of you connecting with each other via the Padlet and read how the content resonated with you. Throughout the webinar, the presenters will be asking you to share your experiences, so make sure you're continuing to use the Padlet via the link to ask questions, share your thinking, and see what others have to say. While we always encourage you to watch the webinars live with us at home, we understand that things come up, so please note that all webinars will be recorded and uploaded to BASTO 307 in the coming days, so you can catch up on anything you've missed. To any of you still experiencing technical difficulties, make sure you send through an email to the BASTO Digital Learning team. I've had this email address tattooed into my memory since Webinar 1, so please send any emails through to digital.learning@basto.vic.edu.au. Without further ado, I'd love to pass you over to Tracy, who will introduce the team responsible for Webinar 2 on the workshop model. Over to you, Tracy.
Thanks, Laura. A very warm welcome to you all for Webinar 2. As Laura said, my name is Tracy Skiba. I will be facilitating the session along with my fellow master trainers, Emma Masterson, Jessica Jensen-Schmidt, Claire Spillane, and Ben Hawthorne. Now, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting. On your behalf, I pay our collective respects to our elders, both past and present, and I would also like to acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. As we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, please share in the Padlet the land that you come from today. As I am currently from contested land, I can only acknowledge the traditional owners of all lands. So we are up to Webinar 2, and this is where we're going to unpack the workshop model and how it aligns with the gradual release of responsibility and the high impact strategies. Here is a very brief agenda today, so there will be some breaks, but really we're going to just show you the reader's workshop, the writing workshop, and how it links together. So on the next slide, you'll see it in a little bit more detail. First we might actually meet the team. So there are our names, and again, if you do have any questions or want some support moving forward, you'll be able to contact us via BASTO. So our essential underpinning today is that schools need an instructional model that will be used throughout the school, and hopefully you'll see that come through in our sessions. And we have a learning intention success criteria, just as all good lessons do. So today we're hoping that through research, you will understand the pedagogical approaches that are most effective in maximising student outcomes. So we will be seeking your feedback to see how well we've met the success criteria, which is understanding how that gradual release of responsibility aligns with the workshop model, where you can identify the high impact teaching strategies that are implemented within this model, and also those effective reading and writing practices that fit within this too. So another opportunity to use the Padlet. We would like to hear a little bit of formative assessment from you in your understandings of what you already know. So our first question to you is, what are the parts of the workshop model that you know already? what is the purpose of the workshop model, and how do the parts support the purpose of the workshop model? So how do those two elements align? So again, an opportunity for our master trainers to get some formative assessments from you. So we will be also undertaking a webinar assignment, which we will go into in further depth later on with Ben, but really looking at some key understandings and connections from the webinar and seeing where you'd like to move to next in terms of building your understandings. So that at the end, there will be 10 minutes to complete this later, but you will have more time to unpack that further. And over to you now, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy, and to Laura for our introductions this afternoon. Before I begin, I'd just like to make clear the fact that all of us presenting tonight are teachers in real schools just like you. And while the content we'll be delivering today is all evidence-based, I think the reason we're all so excited to be here sharing it with you tonight is because we practice it in our classrooms, in our schools. We know that this works, and we know that it can work for you too. So I think that all the presenters would agree tonight that the workshop model has not only changed the way we teach in our own schools, but more importantly, I truly believe it has really changed the way students learn. And hopefully we can unpack that a little bit more tonight. So as Tracy touched on, and as we looked at in webinar 1, our course is based on the essential underpinnings that form the framework of Bastow's literacy suite. So the essential underpinning that we're going to be looking at tonight again is schools need an instructional model that will be used throughout the school. And I think it's important to note that this instructional model needs to be adopted by all teachers in all learning areas throughout the school. So also in webinar 1, you were introduced to Simon Sinek and his big idea around the why is often just as important as the what, maybe more important. So with that in mind, let's touch on the why. So why is an instructional model important for schools? So for one, we can see that an instructional model helps us develop that shared language around our teacher practice. And I know as practitioners, I think we can see the benefits of that, but I'd also like you to put that student hat on as well and think about the benefits that language can have for our students. And we're going to see this in action and the power it has to put this language into our students' hands later in the webinar when we look at a reading and writing workshop in action. Now, another thing that an instructional model does is it helps us develop those consistent teaching practices across the school. So once again, if we have a model that's devised around evidence-based approaches such as the gradual release, that provides us a framework for our teachers to reflect, as well as to give us some kind of structure around our professional learning. Now, I think last but not least is what an instructional model does is it provides consistency for our students. Now, when we're able to provide consistency, predictability and routine for our students, it takes away all of the guesswork. And what that does is it allows our students to focus on the task at hand. And what we're going to see it tonight is what we're aiming for is that independence. So if we're able to take away all the guesswork, we allow our students to really focus on that independent work. So back to webinar 1 again, we also heard all of the heavy lifting was done around the theory of the gradual release of responsibility. You'll remember names like Piaget and Vygotsky, and for me, it really took me back to my uni days. But today, we're not going to touch on the theory as much, but I'd really like to quickly bring you back to this model by Fisher and Frey.
So Ben, I think something that's really important about this model is that just because we instruct the students to move through these phases, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can. You have to put the resources, the rituals, the expectations and processes in place to make sure that this can actually happen. For example, using the reciprocal reading process, you wouldn't stand out the front and explain to the students the process and then send them off to go and do it. You'd be sitting down with a group of students, you'd be modelling that thinking, you'd be engaging in that conversation as a group. And ideally what you want to do is move away from the students and allow that reciprocal reading process to happen as a group independently with you watching on and getting some of that formative assessment. You know, if the kids are working if you're working harder than the kids are, then there's something out of balance there in that gradual release model.
Claire, and if we look at this model here, we can see that this is actually sort of looking at the responsibility rather than time. And just like your reciprocal reading example, I think of PE teachers and the gradual release of responsibility, and I think they're a great ambassador for the gradual release, because I know if I look at any PE lessons I've ever observed, the teacher always comes in and starts off by focusing and modelling exactly what they want. And then they allow students to have a crack at it together before ultimately moving into some kind of game where they're able to really hone in on those skills specifically. One thing I know that PE teachers don't do is just let kids get straight into the game without any instruction. And the other thing I know they don't do is they don't spend 20 to 30 minutes talking about what the kids are going to do. And now I know there's many reasons for it, but I think if you look around your school, PE lessons are going to have some of the highest engagement levels. Now, yes, they're out there playing sport and having fun, I know that, but I really truly do believe that this gradual release of responsibility that's practiced in these PE lessons has a big part to do with that.
Great. We're going to move on to the Padlet now, and I can see already that some people have been putting their prior knowledge in around the workshop, and there's a fantastic reflection there. The model allows student choice to engage in their reading and writing through their own interests while supporting them to become independent learners. So thank you for that reflection on the Padlet, and we're going to pose something to you now, just a bit of a rating. So as a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most familiar, how familiar are you with the workshop model? And I would pose something to you now. So if you're one of those people putting the 4 or 5 down on the page, I'd really pose that question of what can you do as a leader then, of someone who's really familiar with this content? What can you do in your context to make sure that those people who are less familiar are really brought along with you? And Ben, when I think about the workshop model, I really think about, back to my dad's woodwork shop. That's where I am. And the words that I'm thinking about are, it's active, it's focused, it's productive. We're working together and we're learning by doing. And I think that really is the same in the reading and writing workshop as well.
Definitely. And I suppose in that workshop of your dad's, it's really goal orientated as well, Claire.
Yeah, for sure.
So Claire, I thought we'd start by having a look at the workshop model as a whole. So would you like to be able to go into this in a little bit more depth, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got the model here, and this model, this representation, will be used throughout the presentation. And there's just a few things I want to point out before we get stuck into it. The opening, you'll notice, is actually over at the left-hand side. It's not at the 12 o'clock on the clock, because this doesn't represent an hour block. There's some of our secondary colleagues, they're really lucky to have those double period sessions. So this is really looking at the percentage breakdown of time.
Claire, and I'm glad you brought up there that secondary college setting, because we know the workshop model works very well within a primary school setting. And I'd really like to stress that it actually works just as well right up into our middle years, into years 7, 8 and 9. And there's a lot of schools now that are able to be implementing that. And that's really giving our students a great grounding. If they're moving through the primary setting with this instructional model, this same workshop model, and then into years 7, 8 and 9, it's really giving them a great start.
Yeah.
So Claire, as we go through the workshop model today, we're going to have a look at it with a few different lenses, and I'd like to focus in on some of the hits as well as the core teaching practices. Now, we're just going to touch just very lightly on these hits and core teaching practices, and then you'll be able to see these in action throughout our reading and writing workshops. So you mentioned that our over at the 9 o'clock, this is our opening, Claire, and this is where we introduce that learning intention for our students. And it's a chance to not only introduce it, but unpack it with our students and make sure that they have a very clear understanding of what is going to be expected throughout the day, or the lesson and more so. Now, this is a chance for us to really activate that need to know as well. And so by talking to the students and saying, well, in the past lessons, we've noticed this is one of the reasons we're learning this today. And then really talking about how this learning and how this this learning intention is going to help them learn better. It provides that agency for the students. And you can see in here we've got those setting goals and feedback, and you can even include questioning, I think, within the hits there.
Great. And some of the questions that we might be asking ourselves when we're planning this part of the workshop is, what will help students connect one day to the next? And how will I share the specifics of what and why the students are learning today? Let's move into the mini lesson, Ben.
Excellent, Claire. So seamlessly we move into our mini lesson, and as a teacher this is our chance to teach something important. So this is where we talk about the what and the how to do the work during work time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so some of those questions that we're thinking about are, what do students need from me to work with more depth and more stamina than they would alone? Because really we want them to be able to do these things independently. And there are lots of core teaching practices that are going to come into play here that you need to choose really specifically for your needs and for the kids' needs.
Mm-hmm. And it's a really great opportunity, Claire. So we're talking about those core teaching practices of modelled and shared and that interactive writing. It's a really great chance for us to make these mini lessons interactive as well. So bringing in protocols such as turn and talk or think, pair and share brings our students into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Claire, we talked about earlier in the why around an instructional model. And we said that it's a great way for schools to maybe structure some of their professional learning. Now, I know you've worked a lot on mini lessons within your school. I was wondering if you could share some of the language that you use.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've just noticed that on the Padlet as well, there's a comment from participants saying, you know, I love walking through the classrooms and seeing the workshop model in action. So this is perfect. So one of the areas you might dive into for professional development, leadership or coaching, we'll be looking at a particular section. So in particular, the mini lesson or the design and the architecture of the mini lesson. And we're using Lucy Calkins as a reference here. So starting with the connection, it's sort of like the listen up part of the lesson, and it's really connecting to previous lessons where you're clearly stating the goal. Then you're moving into the teaching, where you might demonstrate, have guided practice, perhaps explanation with an example or an inquiry, and you'd select one of those core teaching practices. Keeping in mind sometimes that it's better just to tell the secrets, you know, tell the kids exactly what it is that you want them to learn rather than try and use questioning to find the answer. And then you've got the active engagement. This is really key. This is the part within the mini lesson where you're asking the kids to do something specifically with the knowledge that you're sharing with them. So that's where accountable or substantive talk might come in, all of those different strategies. Perhaps they've got whiteboards where they might be working on something with you. But it's really making sure that the kids don't just sit back and remain passive in a mini lesson. There's an expectation that they're going to contribute to the knowledge and those sorts of things within the mini lesson as well. And then we have the link, and that's where we reference the anchor charts and those sorts of things and that direction to launch off into their student work time. Thanks, Ben.
Excellent, and I love that. So straight at our mini lesson, as teachers, we get off the stage and we let the students add it. So a little boy, Harry, in my class, he refers to this time as where the magic happens. And I totally agree with him. So Harry, I think his point is this is where students really get to grapple and wrestle with the content and make it their own knowledge, I suppose. So within this time, we can see all of the hits come out here in our core teaching practices, but we give the students a chance to read and a chance to write. And this is where, and once again, wrestling with that content, they're able to really focus in on the learning intention of the lesson, but also with their own individual learning goals. And while this is happening, we know our teachers have the chance to confer, to run guided groups, and get more assessment that they're able to drive instruction with going forward.
Absolutely. There's a lot of choices, as you can see with the hits and the core teaching practices. A lot of decisions have to be made about the design of your lesson. And so some questions you might ask yourself are, what will students be doing? And what will they read, write, and talk about to make the next step in their learning? Also, what's the concrete evidence of progress that they'll produce? Because you want to be sharing that with them as well.
Excellent. Yeah, and when I look at this, Claire, I notice that this student work time it's the large majority of the whole model. So it's the key, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you can call it work time or you can call it learning time. It doesn't really matter. What matters is what's actually happening during that time.
Now, Claire,
You've selected a quote for us there, Ben, and I'm just wondering, can you tell me a little bit about why you chose it?
I think this quote's here. So we're talking about, like any basic skill, kids need ample opportunities for practice. And if we go down here, we can see that Lucy Calkins is telling us that we need 50 to 60 minutes for writing instruction. Now, the reason I've chose this is because I just think that the workshop model allows for us as teachers to prioritise that independent work time. Now, I, for one, am guilty, and I'm sure we're all guilty at times, for probably not giving our students enough time to really focus and practice those skills and strategies. And I think the workshop model allows for this.
Certainly does. Thanks, Ben. Let's dive into the catch. Tell us a little bit about that.
So the catch, Claire, is just a really quick whole class timeout and an opportunity for us to check in with what's happening. It might be a chance just to make sure we're maintaining the engagement throughout the lesson, or it could be another chance for us to re-engage the students if we're needed.
Yeah, so there's some guiding questions that you might actually be asking yourself there. So what do students need to keep working? What will help them build their stamina and work smarter and gain knowledge or improve their skills and deepen their understanding? How can I support them to make sure that this next section of the student work time, they're going to be successful?
Yeah, and we can see here that often these catches are planned or unplanned. I know for me personally, a lot of them are actually unplanned, and I use them, like it says there, just to clarify any confusions. But it's also a chance to really highlight excellent work that's meeting the success criteria as well. So I'm always trying to bring that success criteria back in throughout the lesson and really using it as an anchor throughout.
Absolutely. And then we're moving back into more student work time. And this is where you've got the options of that second small teaching group, perhaps some conferences. And it's really important to consider here those routines and processes that are going to allow for the kids to be able to do this and keep up their independence. And I know that what's happening at the start of the year in a foundation classroom, you know, we're talking percentages here, but the independent time of a foundation student is going to be far shorter than someone who's in year 8, those sorts of things. So the percentages might be played around a little bit.
And that's the beauty of the model, isn't it? The workshop model, Claire, is we can make this model, we can make it the size or the time to suit, can't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And Ben, you've chosen another beautiful quote here. Do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so we're continuing to focus in on the need for students to have that independent time. So here we can see all the explicit instruction in the world will not make strong readers unless accompanied by lots of experience applying their knowledge, skills and strategies during reading. And it's exactly the same for writing. So it doesn't matter how much we get up the front and how much explicit instruction we give them, if we are limiting that time for independence and limiting that time to practice their skills and strategies, we're actually limiting the learning that's going to occur.
That's right. And it's one of my favourite sayings, Ben, practice makes permanent. So making sure the kids get that practice doing the right things and moving into that independence. And then we move into the debrief, Ben.
Yep, so this is the conclusion of our lesson, and this is a chance for us to reflect on where we've been and a share time, but it's also a great chance for synthesis of learning. So I often use this as a chance as we come back to our success criteria and check in with our students and see where they're at. So if we're able to, once again, use that success criteria as an anchor for our entire lesson, we're able to come back to it and use that success criteria just to see how we've gone.
Yeah, and so some guiding questions you might ask yourself are, what did students accomplish? How am I going to find out what they accomplished? And what progress did they make? And also, what do students need next? Because that formative assessment is going to help me to design future learning experiences for the kids.
Yeah, exactly, and that's where our feedback's coming into it, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And again, Ben, beautiful quote. Tell me a bit about this one.
So this is from Debbie Miller, and it's specifically from her Reading with Meaning book. And this was a book for me that I got as a graduate teacher teaching a prep class. And now, if anyone who's read the book, when I read through it, I met it with quite a lot of skepticism. I was thinking there is absolutely no way prep students can do that. But as I worked my way through the book and began to implement some of the workshop within my class, I worked out fairly quickly that preps are capable of doing this. And I think words in here like choice, differentiation, flexibility, and there at the end, ultimately independence, they really sum up the workshop quite well.
That's right. And that's the whole point of our workshop model. We want to be able to create these students who have a wealth of understanding, they know what to do, and they get to that independence. It's the gradual release of responsibility model tied in beautifully.
So what I'd like to do now, Claire, is let's check in with our understanding and the group's understanding. And I'd like you to use the Padlet to post a reflection using the prompt, I noticed, I liked, or I wondered. So what's something that you've noticed, liked, or wondered from what we've covered so far? And I suppose while we're doing that, Claire, have you got something that you noticed, liked, or wondered?
Yeah, I wondered on those questions, the guiding questions for planning, I'm wondering if I need to come back to those in my PLC during planning sessions to use those to really guide the creation of our lessons.
Yeah. And for me, once in all those quotes, what we've looked at is we're noticing, for me, it's that importance of independence and how the model really facilitates that application of the gradual release of responsibility, I guess. And by having this model, that it can ensure that we're having it in our lessons, and when we've got it across our school, we can ensure it's happening throughout the school.
Absolutely. I can see everyone's getting really busy there. They're all typing away, so it's great to see.
Excellent.
And Ben, I think we're going to hand over to Jess and Emma. They're going to show us the reading workshop in action. So we've talked a bit of theory. They're going to walk us through one of their lessons. Thanks,
Yeah,
Ben.
and I think it will make a lot more sense when we can actually see it in action. So thanks, girls.
Thanks so much, Ben and Claire, for taking us through the structure of the workshop model and just drawing our attention to how we can bring in the different high-impact teaching strategies and the effective teaching practices into our lesson structure. And before I go on, I just have to make a note of one of the comments on the Padlet that Debbie Miller is a dead set legend. Thank you for that comment. She definitely is, and is a big inspiration behind the workshop model and the work we do in our classrooms. So I just wanted to touch on again, I'm Jessica Jensen, and I'll be going through the workshop model in action with the wonderful Emma Matheson. We're going to be looking, like I said, at a workshop in action with a Year 1 class. So before we just kick off, similar to Ben and Claire, we're just going to go through a couple of really wonderful quotes that we found that really support the workshop. Ben. So this is the first one. I'll let Emma talk you through this one.
So before we begin, Ben and Claire raise the importance of independence in our students. And here we have two quotes that really show the significance of independent reading in our students and just giving them time to read. We're going to get you to read through these quotes. And as you're reading through, think to yourself, what are some keywords that really stand out to you? And after we've read them, then we will get you to post those keywords on the Padlet.
Thanks, Emma. We'll just go to the next quote too, Ben. I know it's rather quick, guys. I'm really sorry, but we'll just skip on to the next one. Independent reading ensures that students get rich opportunities to apply skills that they learn during shared reading, guided reading, and other literacy-related experiences. I thought that was a really powerful one to read out, and something that's really coming through with these quotes is, as Ben and Claire really reiterated really strongly, was the independence, building their independence through the gradual release and the workshop model. Emma, what was something that stood out to you?
So I really love the words critical and powerful, and I also love the phrases rich opportunities and giving them the ability to apply their skills. I think that's really important. So now you've got the chance to write down any key words that resonated with you.
Thanks, Emma. Just mindful of time, I'm going to keep moving on. So I'm going to go through the workshop in action. I'm going to share an experience when I visited Emma's classroom and I saw her Year 1's reading workshop. So in this section, we're going to share what the students were doing during the work time and what the teacher was doing, and draw your attention to the teaching practices, the hits, and the gradual release of responsibility in an authentic lesson. Throughout, I'm also going to take the time just to chat to Emma and ask some of those questions that we usually find really challenging and sometimes don't have the opportunity to ask. So when I arrived in Emma's classroom, I was straight away really impressed with what was going on. I saw the students gathering their book boxes, readers' notebooks, pencils, and heading straight down to the learning area to start their session. I noticed that it was a really well-established routine, and during this, I stopped a couple of students just to ask what they had been working on. They almost rolled their eyes at me as they pointed to the anchor chart at the front of the room. Even before the lesson began, I'd already noticed that Emma was drawing upon the hits, in this case, the worked example and the anchor chart at the front of the room. So then we move on to the opening part of the workshop. So I'm about to go in, we're just going to touch on the opening and just talk through what we're likely to see in Emma's workshop. So this first section, as Ben and Claire mentioned, is just where you're opening the lesson and sharing the learning intention and success criteria. This is a really great opportunity to connect the students to their prior learning and set their goals for the learning during the work time. With reference to the gradual release of responsibility, we're up in the I do it phase and just setting those expectations ready for their learning. So let's get back into the workshop in action and I'll talk you through what I saw in Emma's classroom. So as soon as I got in, the students were sitting down in the learning area and Emma just got straight into business. There was no time wasted here. She asked the students to turn and talk to their partner about what they had been learning in previous lessons. I could see the students scanning the room for the anchor charts. While the discussions were taking place, Emma was joining in on conversations and acknowledging their thinking and helping them to elaborate. After this, she asked a few random students to share what they had discussed, which was a nice little segue into what she noticed about their learning from the previous day. She told the students that she noticed that they had been learning some things about empathizing and they were going on to the next steps. So it was really great to see that Emma was using the feedback from the students' work to inform her teaching. She then pulled up the learning intention. Obviously, there'd been some explicit teaching around the learning intention because there was already an anchor chart. So, Emma, we'll go on to the next part where we talk about, we're going to ask Emma some questions about her opening. Emma, I mentioned before, it's nice to have a bit of time to nut out some of the often challenging questions that we share, that we find that really hard to get the answers to. Emma, how did you unpack the word synthesize with your students?
Thanks for having me. So I really like to use the opportunity to teach tricky words and do some vocabulary teaching. I use lots of different websites to work out the etymology of words, and then hopefully students can use the knowledge of words to help them work out other difficult words. And giving students these opportunities and these word-solving strategies then allows them to transfer that into their own learning. And learning intentions always provide such a great opportunity to do this vocabulary teaching.
That's a great answer, Emma. Do you always co-construct the success criteria with the students, or do you have them pre-written?
I always co-construct them with the students, but I do have them pre-written in my plans because there's a direct direction that I want the students to head into, but the students don't know that. I feel like co-constructing it with the students gives them ownership over their learning, and it's important for the students to work that out, but if they're completely off track, you can always slowly guide them into the direction that you want.
Thanks for that, Emma. We're going to jump straight back into the mini lesson section and we'll just talk through some of the things that we expect to see. So as Ben and Claire mentioned, the mini lesson is a great opportunity to do some explicit teaching and work with the students to build them from the I do it phase through to their independence. And you'll notice in the slides that during the mini lesson, you can cover quite a range from the gradual release of responsibility and bring in a range of different high impact teaching strategies as well as core teaching practices. So let's jump straight into watch Emma's mini lesson in action. So Emma straight away drew their attention to the anchor chart from yesterday and reinforced the learning intention by recapping that today we'll be synthesizing our knowledge after reading. She was all set and ready. The book was displayed on the screen and the anchor charts were up and ready to go. Emma then jumped into modelled reading, one of the core teaching practices. She shared aloud that she would be looking for a few facts about cicadas as she read. After reading a few pages, she stopped to think aloud when she was aware that she was learning something new. I could see that this was planned as she slipped a post-it note out from her book and placed it on the anchor chart. She placed it on top of one of the already existing facts, and she shared aloud with the students that she placed it on top because she had already known that information. This was a great example of I do it with a gradual release. And something that Ben and Claire mentioned was really having that think aloud, that opportunity to tell the students what they were what they were doing. She then continued reading and asked the students to raise their hand when they learned a fact about cicadas. She eventually stopped reading and got the students to turn and talk to their partners about the fact and discussed if it was new information or something that they already knew. I could tell that Emma was starting to move through the gradual release of responsibility and was bringing in the we do it part. Emma then called upon some students at random, and the students were able to share what they had discussed with a partner. These responses written on post-it notes, and Emma asked the students to explain where they might go on the anchor chart, whether they go on top of an existing fact or whether they're a new bit of information. The students mimicked Emma's original thinking process and said it was a fact we already know, so it should go on top of a post-it note. Emma repeated this process once more, engaging the students in conversation and asking them rich questions, providing instant feedback on their thinking. In the last part of the mini lesson, Emma increased their ability to work independently. She displayed a page of the book on the interactive whiteboard and asked the students to work with their pairs to write down some facts on a post-it note and decide if their facts was existing or new knowledge. She added these then to the writer's notebook. This took them to the next phase of the gradual release of responsibility. You do it together. Emma recapped on the main points of the mini lesson and linked it to the learning intention and success criteria from the opening. Then the students were all ready to go off into their independent learning time. The mini lesson should really be capped at around about 10 minutes. It's a lot to get through, but if you really use your time effectively, you can get through most of those parts within the 10-minute time frame. I'm going to just move on to Emma and ask her a few questions about some of the things that we saw in the mini lesson. I noticed that she used a lot of anchor charts in her mini lesson, and I was just going to ask her a little bit about why she uses so many in her lessons.
No worries at all. So anchor charts are a really great resource for students to refer to and to encourage independence. It's another tool that they can use to help support their learning, and they can go there rather than coming to you all the time. We like to refer to these as worked examples, which is a prime example of HITs, and it's great for the students to be able to refer to them when they're off reading or working independently.
Great, thank you, Emma. The next one I was going to ask you is, I noticed that you shared your thinking during the mini lesson. I was wondering why you did that.
So the best way for students to become competent readers is for them to hear thinking or the thinking of an experienced reader. By letting the students into our minds while we read, we give them the strategies to be able to apply them to their own learning and their own reading. This is why I just love think-alouds. It allows us to move through the gradual release of responsibilities to ensure students understand exactly what they're expected to do.
That's a great answer, Emma. I'm also noticing that on the Padlet there's someone who's commented that think-alouds are great for secondary too, and I think that's really important to highlight that think-alouds are really important in any year level to really develop the students' thinking skills.
Absolutely.
I also noticed that you use turn and talk quite a lot. What's the purpose behind the turn and talk?
So turn and talk partners build in the HIT strategy of metacognitive thinking and talking. They say the best way to learn something is to either teach it or talk about it to somebody else. So allowing students time to talk is imperative for their understanding. I make sure that my students have the same turn and talk partner for a reasonably long amount of time. And the reason for this is because it creates safety and comfortability with one another, and they can really feel like they can open up about their learning with one another. So it's really important.
Very articulate. Thanks, Emma.
So now what we'd like to do is we would like to invite you again to add any aha moments or any questions on the Padlet. I know I've already seen one comment on the Padlet that was stating that there's a worry for young readers who can't independent read during the reading workshop, and this is why we wanted to point this one to a Year 1 classroom just to show how it is done. I have lots of non-readers in my classroom, so hopefully this will clarify a few misunderstandings.
Yeah, thanks, Emma, and hopefully we'll get some time at the end also to address some of those questions. So I'm going to move on to the work time now and just bring your attention to the elements that you might see during this time. So as Ben and Claire mentioned, of course, work time is the time that the students have to work independently to achieve the learning intention and success criteria. So this is where we move down the gradual release of responsibility, and we're aiming to get the students into that independent practice. But you may also bring in the you do it together just to build their understanding and scaffold their learning. So, and it's also, and you would have seen the massive list that Ben and Claire had. We've just, with the high impact teaching strategies, it's a real opportunity to bring pretty much all of them into it. We're just focusing on a few in our in Emma's work time. So we're going to jump back into Emma's work time when that moment that the students go off into the abyss that is their workstation, and see how it all pans out. So I noticed when we went back into the classroom that the students had headed back to their learning spots and got themselves organised and on track straight away. Emma did roam around the classroom for a moment, chatting away to the students. She went to a few students who were already settled. I thought maybe that they were fake reading, but she shared with them what she had noticed from their work yesterday and gave them the next steps in their learning. It was so great to see her giving feedback straight away. She then went over to some students who were taking a little longer to get organised with their belongings. We all have those ones. And she prompted them with some questions and referred them back to the worked example with the anchor chart at the front of the room. And then they got underway pretty quickly after that. Emma then went over to start working with her guided reading group, another one of our core teaching practices. So I'm going to guide you through what I saw in Emma's guided reading group. When Emma sat down, the students were already talking about the front cover. I could tell that they had done this before. She began by asking the students what they had been working on the previous guided reading session, and she started to bring in the high impact teaching strategy of questions straight away. The students recapped on some of the learning over the past few weeks and opened the page in their books with an incomplete anchor chart that they had been making together in their notebooks. She shared that they would be learning another strategy today and wrote the learning intention on a whiteboard. Emma repeated the same structure that she followed in the mini lesson with the new decoding strategy that she was working on with the guided reading group. She modelled, shared her thinking aloud, got students to participate in practice, and then helped them to expand their thinking and their learning. She then explained to each of the students that she would read with them independently, and she would be focusing on the new strategy that they had just learned. When she was reading with the students, she was able to ask questions and give feedback. This allowed for differentiated teaching, and I also noticed that she was working in a small group. Emma was able to move through the gradual release of responsibility model. Emma finished the guided reading session by asking some questions about the strategy they had been working on, and they added to their mini anchor chart in their workbook by drawing the strategy out. The students were then told to work on this strategy during work time 2 before she moved on to the catch. So I'm just going to bring Emma back with us. Just getting muddled on my words. I'm just going to bring Emma back in with us for a moment. I'm just going to ask her a couple of things about the work time, some of those challenging things about getting the non-readers to actually engage in independent reading. So one of the big parts of that, Emma, is how do you support students with their book choice to help them read?
So we have a large range of texts for students to choose from in our classroom library. Without that choice, students just tend to lose interest. So we build expectations with the students straight away by letting them know how many books at a minimum should be in their book boxes, and I constantly check on their book boxes and their choices during conferences.
Awesome. How did you build the expectation with the students during the reading time, during the work time, to make sure they're reading, even when they struggle to read?
So I'm constantly watching levels of engagement and reading stamina during independent reading. I just don't jump straight into guided reading groups or strategy groups. I like to sit back and observe a little bit. If I notice any off-task behaviours or any students who might be flipping from book to book, I'll jump on it straight away. And I also check their reading logs quite a lot. We have a huge range of books, like I said, in our classroom library, and they're all grouped in different ways, so that helps as well.
Oh, that's a fantastic idea. Thanks for sharing. We're going to move quickly on to the catch, which, as Ben and Claire said, that is can be either planned or unplanned, and is a really great opportunity to kind of guide the students in the right direction and just recap on the learning intention and success criteria. In this phase, you can bring in a huge range of the high impact teaching strategies, as well as continue to build the students' independence. I'm just going to take you through what I saw in Emma's couch because I thought it was a little unusual and different. So when I was in Emma's classroom, I noticed that she used this time to get the students to share what they had been learning, and she also supported them to make deeper connections with what they had been doing and extend their thinking by providing feedback and asking probing questions. She then informed the students that they'd be moving on to work time 2, and she pointed them to the choice board at the front of the room. This showed me that the students had a choice of the different things that they could complete during work time 2, which was really great in promoting student agency. So I'm just going to ask Emma a little bit about the choice board, just to clarify how that came about.
So all of the skills and strategies that are on the choice board have been explicitly taught in the past, and we focus on those with what the class needs at the time. So it's not just a free-for-all, and I check on what the kids are doing by looking at their readers' notebook entries when I conference with them.
Thanks, Emma. And then we will move on to work time 2. So once the students have had their couch, they move on to the second work time. And as you would have seen on the choice board, they had the option of different activities, or they could continue on with the work time from work time 1. During work time 2, I'm just really going to draw your attention to what Emma was doing during this time to focusing on those core teaching practices that she was using. So the students were continuing on with independent practice, but during this time, Emma was conferring with a group of students. I'm going to talk you through that conference. So while I was watching, Emma did 2 conferences, and they were a fantastic example of differentiated teaching, questioning, feedback, and goal setting. I'm just going to zoom in on one of them today. So before the conference, she reviewed the notes from the last meeting with that child. The students together looked through their notebook entries, and together they talked through the learning. She asked the students to describe their work with a really, really strong focus on complimenting them as they shared their work. Emma then provided some feedback, supported with examples, and gave a little bit of a teaching point as to what the student could do to enhance their learning. I might just move on nice to the question time, just to wrap it up nice and quickly. So the students during that time were looking at goal setting. Emma, I was just wondering, how do you balance setting goals with the unit of study?
So my team and I sit down at the beginning of the unit of study, and we work out 5 large goals for the students to work on. We make sure that all different avenues fit under those goals, like fluency and decoding if they need to, and we just point the students in one of those 5 goals so that we don't have 15 different goals going on at the same time.
Yeah, fair enough. That can be really hard to manage. The last part of the workshop is the debrief. So I'll just take you quickly through that. That's a great opportunity to tie all the learning back in to the success criteria and learning intention, and get the students really reflecting on their understanding and even building upon what they did in the work time. So during this, we're bringing back to the independent phase and really deepening that understanding of the student learning. So during Emma's debrief, the students met back in the learning area with their reader's notebook. I noticed that Emma again used think, pair, share to enable the students to reflect on what they had done in the learning time. She gave them time to think about the learning and then asked them to raise fingers to show the success criteria that they had demonstrated during the learning time. She then asked the students to share with a partner what they had learned and what they think they could try out next. She invited a few students to share their thinking and acknowledge their achievement and strategies they used to achieve the learning. She then helped the students to think about their next steps through deep questioning and feedback. Emma then wrapped up the workshop by congratulating the students on their work and told them that they could put their reading tools away and get prepared for their writers' workshop. So Emma, just to touch on the debrief, I noticed that the kids were really, really clear on the learning intention and success criteria. How come they were so clear on what they were doing and what they were learning?
So we have an overall scope and sequence of reading and writing units that build from year to year. At the beginning of every unit, we decide what we want our readers to be able to do, understand, and by the end of the unit, and how that aligns with the achievement standards in the VIC curriculum, which we then build our mini lessons from. We also spend a lot of time at the beginning of the year. Our first unit on our scope and sequence is establishing the Readers and Writers workshop. So we make sure that those routines are really instilled in our students so that we don't have to revisit it as the year goes on.
Cool. And the other question I had was, they were so articulate, better than I am, articulate about sharing their learning. How have you managed to build that up with your students?
So I'm always bringing my reflections back to the learning intention and success criteria, which is based on skill and not task. I spent lots of time at the beginning of the year planning questions that I could ask students to support their reflection and to dig deeper so that I wasn't getting responses like, I read the whole time or I wasn't distracted.
Yes, we've all had those. Thank you so much, Emma, for joining us today and just sharing a little bit of insight into your teaching. We'll refer you back to the Padlet. Emma's just going to share a prompt with you.
Yes, so we have a small prompt that we'd like you to contribute to on the Padlet. So what are some new teaching practices that you have been exposed to? And whilst you're filling this in, on the last slide, we just have some resources that have not only built our knowledge, but are well known for developing many teachers' knowledge of the reading workshop. So if you haven't seen these before, note some of them down.
Thanks, Emma and Jess. We are, Tracy and I are going to dive into our writers' workshop in action. And this is when I got to visit Tracy's classroom. And it was a grade 5 classroom. And we'll walk you through the workshop, identify where the gradual release of responsibility aligns, as well as the hits. But we are going to use the same structure that Emma and Jess used, so we'll skim through a little bit faster. Thanks, Ben. Slide. Just setting the scene. Tracy, can you share a little bit about who the kids are?
Sure. So this is a grade 5 class who is has been accustomed to the workshop model for a number of years now. So this is a group of students who come from a range of abilities, including EAL, who, again, have seen the workshop model for a number of years.
Thanks, Ben. Next slide. I thought this was really important, particularly because we're talking about open cycle writing here. It may be a new sort of concept for some people playing along at home. So I've got that up on the screen there. I won't read it out, but there are some keywords that I want to draw your attention to. So cycling through the writing process, selecting their own topics, making decisions, self-selected publication, and that really important last line there, teachers choose writing instruction that's specifically tailored to the writers in their classroom. This is not about teaching to the writing, we are teaching our writers. So Tracy, how does this align with the effective teaching and gradual release model?
Great. So, look, open cycle writing can seem really daunting, especially from what we're seeing in the Padlet that, you know, the behavioural issues to deal with, all sorts of other factors that come into play. But it's a really great approach because it's rather than a march through the teaching where you lead the charge, you're ticking off the curriculum from the front and everything remains the same. It's a dance. And that's the key part that you need to take from this. Sometimes you're leading, sometimes you're letting the writing take you where it needs to go. And it's knowing as the teacher when to loosen the reins to actually get the best out of your students in this process.
Thank you. Ben, next slide. Can you tell us how you developed this unit of writing and, you know, how you came to create this theme of our writing is powerful and we have a voice that needs to be heard?
Sure. So this unit was developed from my observations and notes taken of students during previous writing times and how the quality of their work seemed to be just dropping after, you know, such a period of time. I was noticing as well that the students weren't seeing themselves as writers. And I thought that that was also part of it, is that it was a chore to them. They didn't see a purpose. They don't see the audience. Why bother? You know, we know what senior students can be like, especially as they move into secondary school. They will coalesce on it. So I took the core belief about authentic writing that at its heart, it needs an authentic audience. And I also wanted to explore the idea of how peers have used writing to change the world and be heard. So it was a call to action to my children. Just like Ben said, I was the coach. I wasn't the sage on the stage. I was going to coach them like I would if it was a team. So I wanted them to write to an audience and in turn receive feedback from their audience.
Thanks, Ben. Next slide. Thank you. Tracy, I'm wondering how you established that independence in the writing workshop.
Sure. So first of all, I really build that understanding of a community. So a community of writers where we celebrate the mistakes as learning. I take a lot of time to build practices that build routine and safety, which then in turn encourages my students to take risks in their writing. Because as we know, you can't edit a blank page. So that was really important. I also talk a lot about the thinking processes behind writing and align them to metacognitive strategies and visuals and anchor charts. And some of those anchor charts aren't always on the wall. Again, we know in secondary settings, they need to be virtual, sometimes through Google Classroom, sometimes uploaded, sometimes in their writer's notebooks. I also make sure that there's time prioritised for them to write both independently, with peers, and in small teaching groups. Again, you can't improve writing if they're not practicing.
Absolutely. And I'm seeing on the Padlet there, authentic purposes for writing is so important. Couldn't agree more. Thanks, Ben. Next slide. And the writers' workshop environment, Tracy, it was so lovely to come into your classroom and have a look around at what was happening. And you can see I've made a list of some of the things that I could see in the environment, but I really wanted to take note of the use of mentor texts and how they were accessible to students. They had been unpacked and were really well known. And there was evidence to me that there was both the open cycle writing and processes established, but also teacher-directed writing as well. Next slide, Ben. Thank you. So you began a lesson with the opening, and I saw students sitting on the floor with their writer's notebooks and their drafting folder. They were reading their writing while others came to the floor, and there was some quiet discussion between some of the students about their writing. It was really obvious to me that students had already been paired up and established partners to work with because they were seeking each other out on the floor. And you began the lesson by giving feedback on the low numbers of students deciding to take their writing all the way through to the publishing and celebrating stage of the writing cycle. And you said something really beautiful, Tracy, and I actually made a note of it. You said, you have a powerful voice, important things to say, but without sharing your work, no one will hear you. And into the mini lesson. Tracy, do you want to share something from the mini lesson?
Sure. So again, that opening really lined up with the mini lesson. And sometimes an opening doesn't have to be long. It can just be that showing that you have looked at their work and you're taking them seriously as writers. So I wanted to highlight the feedback from the lesson and then assist the direction of the mini lesson. So if you look at the next slide, I'll show you a little bit of what I did. So this was, again, I wanted to catch students regarding their writing and showing that they knew them as writers. And I wanted to facilitate rather than teach what comes next in this aspect. So with this, I wanted to show them that I'd noticed things from their previous workshops. And then I wanted them to look at how they could create power and purpose and audience through a piece of writing. So I showed them a mentor text, and this mentor text was something that was a little bit different for them, but how an author creates a sense of power within their writing. And I won't read the stanzas, but I'll give you a moment to have a little look at the first two, because they really lined up with my readers' workshop, because again, we were looking at powerful writing and a sense of voice and audience. And as the students read, I could see them realising that this was not an adult reading this story. Or reading this poem. Next slide. So I took them back into that question of, oh, who wrote this poem? Who do you think is? Could you write like this? Get that growth mindset going. They turned and talked. They shared what they thought might be going on, but still they weren't trusting that it might be another child that could have written this. So when I exposed that it was a Year 5 student, a student who was a refugee to Australia who'd been learning English for 4 years, there was just an aha moment where they thought, hold on, okay, other peers are writing and they've got powerful writing, let's go with this. And then this was also how we developed the success criteria.
So Tracy, when I was watching your mini lesson, what I was thinking about is I wondered the types of mini lessons that had come before this session and then also the ones that would follow. So when you're designing your mini lessons, you can choose between the writing process and teaching something specifically there, the craft, where you might bring in the traits or author's craft, and then the management and procedural types of mini lessons. And obviously today you had chosen craft. Next slide, please, Ben. And
Yeah,
then,
so
then I saw you address the success criteria. Can you talk about how you went about this?
Sure. So again, the students had been really set up to get used to the idea that we co-create success criteria. And I also wanted to make it something purposeful for them to give themselves personal feedback on how they were going with their writing, but also to develop that language that they could use to talk about others' writing too. So really having a few mixed layers with that. So I created the learning intention for this one, but I asked them to help me co-create it in kid-friendly language based around what they saw in this powerful piece. And that's what they co-created with me, which again, I had some ideas in my head. It wasn't that I just went willy-nilly with it. I really thought about it and let them move forward with it. Keeping it simple means it's easy to refer back to.
Next slide, Ben. And then I noticed substantive talk in action, and you were really getting the kids to use that authentic feedback. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I think that's one of the key things we sometimes forget, that we often are the ones, like right now, we're doing the talk rather than letting the students really unpack that. So as part of the mini lesson, I wanted to hear what the students were thinking. So whilst they were conducting some think pair shares, I was listening in and observing which students already had ideas. They were getting out their writer's notebook. They were scribbling what they cared about. Others were just listening and observing other students, and some I could see were struggling. So they were the ones that were already in my head to actually catch for the next part of the lesson. But yeah, so really, I think it's important to go back to that Bowie quote that it's not my ideas that are going to help them write, it's their ideas that are going to bring them to write.
Next slide, please. Just a prompt, and I can see there's lots of talk happening on the Padlet at the moment. This is a great opportunity for us to share across the state our different ideas of how would you choose and use a mentor text. Thanks, Ben. Next slide. Tracy, how do you know that students are going to do what they're meant to do, particularly in a setting like open cycle writing?
Oh gosh, I can honestly say, Claire, it took a long time to set this up, and I put my hand on heart and say that it was very tricky at the start. In fact, sometimes I thought, oh, it's pretty much a zoo out there. What am I doing? So you have to rein it back. You've got to set up those routines and that accountability with the kids. So before they leave the floor or before they move off to do their own writing, however you've set up the room, they need to have a check-in with you, a verbal exit ticket, per se, in another way. So, for example, I would ask, where to next for you as a writer? And they have to be able to answer me. If they can't answer me, they know that they need some support. And often they will say they're going to have a go unpacking a powerful piece. They're going to create a seed around those ideas. They're going to refer back to some of their previous writing and see if they can find some of those elements of power within that piece to refine. Or maybe they're ready for revision and some feedback regarding their writing in a small group or with a peer. And that's when I moved to getting students to work with me in a small group. They're the ones who I've observed that need that quick check-in, that let's get onto the same page, let's get some scaffolding and modelling so that they feel empowered to move forward.
Next slide, please, Ben. And that's exactly what I saw you do with that teacher group. Using some students who'd been identified already, but also using that exit ticket or that substantive talk in the mini lesson to identify which students needed to stay with you to ensure that they were able to be successful in that work time. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thanks, Ben. Next slide. Thank you, Ben. And we've got another Padlet prompt for you about how you manage your independent writing time in your own classroom. And so I know that from the last time we were asking people that someone has referenced the trait there as a way to select their mentor text. Tracy, do you want to talk quickly about the catch?
Absolutely. So the catch, there was a few questions on the Padlet. The catch, I think, is one of those really important things to do with your class, and it can be to refer back to the mentor text and to get the children reminding them about the learning intention success criteria. With this one, again, I was working on feedback. So I gave this as an opportunity for those students to roam the room, have a look at what other students were writing, and using that language from the success criteria, actually verbalise why they thought another peer had shown a powerful piece or had shown elements of power in their writing. So again, that gave me a sense of where are we sitting in the lay of the land, and also to give those students an authentic audience, because as we know, students love when other people read their writing.
Next slide, Ben. Thank you, Ben. Yeah, we can see the reference you used there, Tracy.
Yeah, and again, this would have been a mentor text from another lesson, which students might have actually touched base on. But again, this was just a quick feedback.
Next slide, Ben. And then we're moving into that more writing time, and this is where students continue to work independently or with a peer. And I also saw you conduct a conference. Next slide, Ben. So I'm wondering, what are the expectations on students to revise their own work and the work of others?
So I think that's one of the really key elements. You don't want the shopping queue in front of you as the teacher, because essentially you are the CEO of that classroom and you are too busy to do that. So if you can build some of that editing and those revision strategies with your class, it makes it a lot easier. Again, it takes time. So some things to build into: having a space where students move to when they're ready for that revision time, having checklists that they can tick through so then other peers can help them with that process. And also, when they move to a conference, having had the time to actually read their writing before they come to you is essential.
Next slide, please. Tracy, you worked through a conference with a student and you did something really interesting. You then invited another child over to listen in on the conversation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So again, with the process of the writing conference, something that worked for me as a teacher was having an in-tray where the students who were ready for that conference with me had some clear targets for where to next. Maybe they were working on a goal, or maybe they were stuck. But there was always that expectation that other peers had worked with them before they came to me. So using some of the notes I'd made of what I'd noticed in their writing and looking at previous goals that they were working on, that's when the student would come to me and we would work together to drive that conversation. Now, if I noticed that one of their revisers or somebody that was working with them had built some misconceptions into that editing and was struggling themselves, that's a great time to bring that peer up as well, because then you can actually have two students working together and building their understandings, and it drives a lot more importance on that sense of peer editing or peer revision, you know, which we know that some students just don't like to do. But if they know they're going to be accountable, it makes it a lot easier. And again, sticking with just one piece of feedback. We can get overwhelmed as teachers thinking, oh my gosh, how do we mark everything? Don't. Do not mark everything. Do not take the books home for a weekend away. Work one piece of feedback, make that the teachable moment, and you'll find that your life is a lot easier and your students will be clearer about their way forward.
Next slide, Ben. Thank you. And then we moved into the debrief, where you really pulled all the students together. The students were able to use their metacognitive strategies to think about themselves as writers and reflect on their own and other students' writing as well as setting goals for the following lessons. Next slide, Ben.
Yeah, so this was where I went again back to the learning intention success criteria and gave the students some time to think about where they were in terms of this. Possibly writing reflections in their own notebooks or making a note on their drafts about what they had seen that was working and what they were maybe struggling with. I also took this as a time to celebrate all stages in the writing. So not just the published pieces, and definitely not a time where they just read the whole thing to you as the class. Celebrate the struggle, because sometimes students think that writing is a perfect process, and it certainly isn't, as we know, as we grow older. So share in the joy of writing with the students, but share in the struggle and celebrate that struggle as a real thing, so then they see that as purposeful. I also take the feedback from the students. So when they say that there was a struggle or a misconception or they need help with something else, that helps me refine my next writing lesson. So take their voice and their agency within that to help you in the next stage.
Next slide, then. And so we're really coming back to that opportunity to share their writing with others. That audience is so important. We've got some examples here. In an online environment, we've got Padlet being used as a place to share their writing, but really also celebrating the writing process as well, not just the final outcome. Next slide, please, Ben. you know, there's lots of ways to celebrate writing. The author's chair is a great concept. I know in our school with our foundation to year 2 kids, each classroom has a Wonder Writer's cape. And so every day one student gets awarded the Wonder Writer's cape, and at recess and lunchtime they're running around. You know, it's just building that excitement and that community of writers and celebrating any of the positive stages during the writing process and themselves as writers. And we're going to finish here, Tracy, on a Padlet question.
That's right. So we talked at the start about how it's not a march, it's a dance with your students. So here's our question to you. How are you going to dance with your students during the writers' workshop? Picking just one thing. And before we move over to Ben, I can see that we've had some questions about spelling, grammar, handwriting, and so on. So again, there are so many different elements. I know as a teacher, I used to, in my junior classes, use my phonics time, my time when I was unpacking that, as my handwriting time, because then they would build those skills regularly over the week. Things like spelling, that was often my catch. And if I had a job for every time I fixed because, or BECAUSE, as my preps used to sing, that was a catch. You know, those were the things that we looked at. But you may want to look at a phonics spelling program that can actually be embedded and used within your openings or mini lessons as well.
And Tracy, it also depends on the type of mini lesson. Today we've demonstrated a craft mini lesson, but perhaps there's a different focus that you want for your writing session. It also comes down to the core teaching practices. So if you're looking at spelling, perhaps interactive writing is a better choice for that particular lesson. Next slide, please, Ben. And then we've also just got a couple of resources. I know anyone starting out with open cycle writing in particular, Rolf Fletcher is, you know, I think a great place to start with his writing workshop, the Essential Guide. Reading that gives you a really good visual of what it would actually look like in the classroom. Thanks, Ben.
So, I think this is where I'm going to come in, girls. Am I right?
You are right. You're right on
Yes.
time.
Excellent.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you for that. So we're now going to give everybody 10 minutes to start to have a think about our webinar assignment. Now, what I would like to say first that is just a big thank you to Jess, Tracy, Claire, and for taking us through those workshops in action. So I think it's one thing for us to go through and talk through the model and what it looks like, but to actually see it in action is quite another thing. So thanks, guys. One thing I took from it was that, and Tracy, you mentioned this really well, it's not something that you're going to be able to implement and perfect overnight. And we've noticed that there's a lot of moving parts to an actual really rigid workshop model. So with that in mind, we've posed this question for you to reflect on as your webinar assignment. We'd like you to choose which of the following areas you'd like to investigate further and reflect on why you think it is important for you. So maybe it's the gradual release of responsibility within the workshop. Possibly it's the hits. Maybe you'd like to look more at the literacy toolkit between the reading and writing practices. You might like to look at the workshop model and the components that make it up, or possibly maybe finding more examples of the workshops in action. So remember, this is 200 words or less, so it shouldn't take a great deal of time, but it is an important component of our course, and it's actually a requirement. So if we can give you some time now to do that, hopefully be able to get that done and maybe get it up onto Basto 307. So while you're doing that, I'd just like to pose a few of the questions that have been coming through the chat, and there's been some absolutely great questions, and Tracy's already touched on the grammar. Tracy, do you mind if I ask you another question around the catch? And do you actually have to have a catch in every lesson?
Look, it's tempting not to sometimes, especially when you see students really embedded in their writing or you can't get them to look up from their books. But you know what, if you've seen something and you know that they could just hear that one little piece of feedback to connect back to the beginning of the lesson, I think it's essential. Even, and this is just from a realistic point of view, sometimes your students need a quick break just to reflect and not just keep writing reams and reams of pages, which I know some of us do have those students that just don't know when to stop and just keep going and going. So the catch helps with that too.
Thanks, Tracy. Now, I might put this next question to Em, and it's around us managing turn and talk remotely and what these protocols look like in a remote learning environment. Do you think you could help me out with that, Emma?
Yes, so I've obviously I use Zoom with my kids. We haven't been able to do turn and talk. It's been quite tricky getting them into situations altogether. But with Zoom, and I know WebEx has it now as well, you can do breakout rooms. So putting them into small groups together, just allowing them to have that time to talk. It's not the same as being in a classroom where it's really quick, but it's something.
Yeah, thank you. There was one that came through before, and I think that Jess answered it quite well. I was wondering if maybe Jess could really maybe go into a bit more depth around the timing of the mini lesson.
No worries, Ben. Yeah, definitely. The mini lesson is one of the kind of squash into that 10-minute period. It's probably took me a whole term to try and really bring it down under that 10 minutes. But it's really important to just be really short and sharp and bring the focus back to the students practicing that skill. And those quotes that we scattered throughout our presentation really highlighted the importance that, yes, the students need explicit teaching, but all the explicit teaching in the world will not make up for the less practice time. So the focus of the workshop is really that independent practice time.
Thanks, Jess. And it's important that we are keeping them as mini lessons, aren't they? Isn't it? And not making those maxi lessons, as we call them, and just getting off the stage and letting the kids go about their business. So, Jess, while I've got you, I might continue to talk to you. So one of the questions that came through the Padlet was, are you meant to do I do, we do, you do in all of your mini lessons?
Not necessarily. I think I was responding to a couple of people on the Padlet. It really just depends on where you are in your unit. So most of the time you're going to do your I do, then we do, and depending on timing, you can get them to practice a little bit more. But it really just depends on where you are at in your unit of learning. But as much as you possibly can, you share your thinking with the students and also bring them, give them the opportunity to share their thinking and practice a skill before they go off and do that independent practice time.
Excellent. Thanks, Jess. And on that idea of timing, for me as a teacher, this was one thing that I struggled with when I was beginning to implement the workshop model. And I was wondering if anybody might like to talk to me about how they were able to hone their ability to, I suppose, get the timing right within their workshops as they implemented them into their class.
So, Ben, I was pretty cutthroat when I first started doing it. I started doing it last year with my year 4s, and I looked at the time that I had, which was an hour, and I actually broke it up into time portions, and I put a timer on my phone. And when I was up the front doing a mini lesson, I gave the timer to my students, and I said that if they were doing what they were expected and I was doing what I expected, I should get that done within that 10 minutes. And that's how I got my timing done.
Excellent. Well, what a great idea. Good. Thanks, Ems. Anybody else?
I was going to add as well, if you are fortunate enough to have a team teaching buddy, if you can have somebody who's working with a small group while you're actually doing the opening or so on to get them up to par, then you'll actually find that you've got a bit more time on your hands too, and they'll also keep you accountable.
Ben, I just want to clarify something. I'm reading the Padlet at the moment and we've got questions coming out about the writer's workshop. Now, I just want to clarify that if you do open cycle writing, that's one way to do the workshop. When the kids are doing writing, that's the writer's workshop. So open cycle sits alongside your genre focus. So you might have a term where you do open cycle writing as your genre, or in my context, we always have a genre sitting side by side. So maybe 3 days a week we'll do the teacher-directed genre focus, whereas 2 days a week will be that open cycle, that student choice style of writing. So I just wanted to clarify that. Even when you're doing teacher-directed writing, you're still using the writer's workshop.
Excellent. And Claire, while I have you there, can you help me out? What are your thoughts? There's a question here about, do you run the reading and writing workshops every day?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's experience. The kids need to be reading every day and they need to be writing every day. So that's 100%. That's what should be happening every day.
Excellent. So I wonder, as we go through here, maybe if we can if there's anybody out there that needs a bit of stimulus for their webinar assignment. Now, I know that all of us have been able to implement the workshop model to some degree. Which one of these do you think would have really would have been you know, maybe 1 year ago, maybe 2 years ago, whenever you started the journey? What would have you been reflecting on here? So would maybe Tracy, which one of these would stand out for you?
Sorry, Ben, was that to where I would move forward with what
So
I'd
I'm
unpack
just having
further
a look
with?
at the webinar assignment here, and if you were in the shoes of our participants tonight, what would you be taking further?
So I would probably try and get as many examples as possible of the workshop model, and as many opportunities to observe others, especially if there are knowledgeable others in your school, which is a great opportunity to build those skills. I'd also be looking at those reading and writing practices as well within the literacy toolkit, and build up your library of books. So a lot of those resources have some really handy hints and tips.
Thank you, Tracy. And I was thinking about myself and our school when we brought this in, and it was really what we did at the start is we began by unpacking what was already happening within our school. And what we found out that we had some hits here and there, we had the gradual release happening here and there, we had some of the toolkit and the core teaching practices here and there. And what we did as a school, we put them all on the table and we said, we know they're all important, but let's come up with something that fits best for us and something that we can implement all of these in. And from there, we're able to say the workshop model is it for us. So let's unpack it together and put them all in.
And I'd be really throwing that challenge back out there again, Ben, from the start of the presentation. If you're someone who gave yourself a 4 or a 5 at the start of the presentation, or even perhaps now you've moved yourself into that category post this presentation, I'd be throwing that challenge out to you to say, what are you going to do to keep yourself accountable and keep your team accountable? So, you know, how are you going to really focus in on that gradual release, or is it a particular hit? Or maybe it's an explicit teaching strategy that you're going to focus on.
I think that's a great point, Claire, because I know myself that we've been working on it in our school, the workshop and the gradual release for over 2 years now. But there's absolutely, I don't feel like I've anywhere near perfected it. So that idea of thinking about our next step and how we can take it further, I think it's great. So we're just going to give us another minute to think about our webinar assignment.
We also just saw a really good question, you know, or a pondering from one of our participants today who said, what about our parents who expect us to mark everything in their books and have that expectation that's what works for teachers? So I actually went through that a number of years ago as a literacy coordinator in a school. You have to really change the culture. So it starts with those parent helper or classroom helper courses where you build a really clear understanding of what the workshop model is, having open afternoons where the families can get to see what it looks like in action, and also when you see how excited the students are to share their work and share what they've been doing in their reading. But it really is about changing that culture and having those high expectations. So you need a really cohesive and clear understanding that this is the approach for you as a whole school. It's very hard to do it alone.
Yeah, that was going to be my point too, Tracy. It's got to be a whole school approach. We've got to be able to educate, you know, our parent community to make sure that they understand what we're doing and why. And really create that partnership. And, you know, the more that we teach students as writers, the more they'll be able to talk about themselves as writers, and the parents will actually see where that feedback is coming through.
Okay, so thank you to the panel, and thank you to everybody for having a look at our prompt, and hopefully you've been able to come up with a few hundred words that you'll be able to put up as your webinar assignment.
Ben, can I just prompt one thing? I noticed that we've got some questions about how does this work in a remote setting. I would really encourage you to have a look at the notes that people had made in their assignments on Basto 307, because lots of people were sharing their ideas there, and also their problems of practice. I know lots of people were having trouble with the we do of the gradual release of responsibility. So go back there and have a look and engage in what's happening online.
Thanks, Claire. So like all good lessons, let's start our debrief by reflecting on where we've been today. So we started off looking at the workshop model and we unpacked those key components. While we did that, we looked at it with the lens of the hits and how they can fit into the workshop model. And then we had a really good look at the workshop, the reading workshop and the writing workshop in action. And what we saw there was that these core teaching practices really fit in so naturally. So before we finish, and once again, like all good lessons, how did we go? We're going to bring our debrief back and we're going to anchor this whole webinar by looking back at our learning intention. Now, our learning intention today was through research, you'll understand the pedagogical approaches that are most effective in maximising student outcomes. And our success criteria would be, we understand how the gradual release of responsibility aligns. We're going to identify those high impact teaching strategies and how they're implemented in the workshop model. And we wanted to understand where effective reading and writing practices fit within the workshop. So this is where we really want your feedback. Just as we would in our actual classroom, we check in with our students to check how they went with their learning. So as we know as teachers, the success of our students is the ultimate indicator of the success of our instruction and the success of our lesson. So what if we think back to the Padlet, and I'd like you in the Padlet, using our trusty 1 to 5 rating system, how do you think we've gone tonight with that success criteria in mind? So before we finish up tonight, let's have another look at the series overview. So far we've had in webinar 1, we looked at the gradual release of responsibility. And then in tonight's webinar, we've looked at the workshop model as an ideal way to facilitate its application. Now, going forward, on Wednesday, the 9th of September, we're going to be looking at authentic literacy and student agency. When I look at this overall series overview, for me, it's it just looks like a little tasting platter. And I really want you to remember that. So within our webinars, all the webinars within these series are really just a little taster of what you can expect from the local leading literacy course in its entirety. So hopefully, if you can engage with the content throughout this series and really delve into something you think and delve into what you want to work on, hopefully this will hold you in good stead if you are to complete the local literacy local leaders course in the future. Either way, if you are able to implement just some of the things that you take away from this series, I know it's really going to have a positive impact on the outcomes of your students. So there's a few ways that you can delve a little bit deeper using BASTO 307. So we would really like you to start connecting with your virtual COP and posting on the discussion board. You might like to post some questions about things that have risen here tonight, or you might like to post what you've been trialling. It's also a really great way for us as master trainers to get to know you and to get to know everybody and what's happening before our workshop at the end of the course. So there's a few other ways we can do this. So if there's anything that's piqued your interest tonight, you can always go back to the webinar 2 recording, and the master trainers will be providing a summary of everything that they've seen tonight on the Padlet and putting it into some kind of organised manner that you'll be able to have a look at going forward. Now remember to submit your webinar assignment by Wednesday the 9th of September, and hopefully many of you have had a good chance to have a go at that already. So that brings us to the end of our webinar for tonight. Now remember, once again, in 2 weeks' time, we'll be looking at authentic literacy and student engagement in webinar 3. So as we finish tonight, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for prioritising the time in what we know is an extremely challenging period. We really hope you've got something out of tonight and something that you'd be able to take forward maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe next term. But on behalf of everybody tonight, we want to say a big thank you, and we'll see you next time.